The bunker lay hidden beneath fresh winter snow, daylight reflecting off frozen earth like a secret refusing to stay buried. Locals called it worthless, an old Cold War relic, sealed and forgotten. That morning, a Navy SEAL stepped onto the land, a man who had survived combat, now carrying a quieter war inside his chest. At his side walked a German shepherd, scarred, disciplined, alert. A dog trained to sense what humans miss. Jack wasn't searching for treasure. He wasn't chasing legends. But the moment the dog stopped, ears locked forward, breathing slow, eyes fixed on the ground, the silence broke. Something deep beneath the snow answered back. What this Navy SEAL and his dog uncovered below the frozen earth would expose a secret meant to stay hidden forever. Because some missions don't end after service. They wait, buried, until the right man and the right dog come home. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments below. Spokane, Washington, looked like a city holding its breath. Fresh winter snow had fallen through the night, coating streets, rooftops, and bare trees in a pale white stillness that reflected the morning light too cleanly, almost painfully bright. The sky was clear but cold, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself with drama, only with a quiet certainty that it would seep through layers of clothing and into bone if given enough time. Traffic was light, breath hung visibly in the air. Spokane had seen winters like this before, but that didn't make them any kinder. An old gray pickup truck rolled in from the highway, tires crunching softly over snow that hadn't yet been touched by salt or plows. The truck was a decade past its prime, paint dulled by years of sun and neglect, the bed scarred with scratches that spoke of heavy loads and harder lives. Behind the wheel sat Jack Miller, 38 years old, broad-shouldered, tall, and built the way men are built when their bodies have been shaped by discipline rather than comfort. His face was angular, jaw sharp beneath a short, untrimmed beard that showed streaks of gray earlier than it should have. His skin was weathered, not from age but from long exposure to sun, wind, and places where comfort was never guaranteed. His eyes were a muted steel blue, calm on the surface, distant underneath, the eyes of someone who had learned long ago how to observe without reacting. Jack wore his U.S. Navy working uniform beneath a heavy winter jacket, the fabric creased and worn in familiar places. The uniform wasn't for show. It was habit. After years of wearing it every day, civilian clothes felt foreign, like a costume he hadn't earned. He had been discharged 3 months earlier, quietly, without ceremony. No parade, no speeches, just paperwork, handshakes, and the sudden realization that the structure he had lived inside for most of his adult life was gone. He had no wife waiting at home, no children counting the days until his return. The war hadn't taken his family from him. It had simply outlasted the possibility of one. In the passenger seat sat Rex. The German shepherd was large even for his breed, black and tan coat, thick and glossy despite the cold, muscles visible beneath his fur when he shifted his weight. At 6 years old, Rex moved with the controlled economy of an animal that had been trained for work, not play. His ears stood alert even as he appeared relaxed, amber eyes tracking movement outside the window without turning his head. A faint scar cut through the fur along his muzzle, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. Rex had earned that scar overseas, during a night Jack preferred not to revisit too closely. The dog had been a military working dog, same as Jack had been a weapon. They had learned each other in environments where trust wasn't optional. When Jack left the service, Rex came with him, officially retired, unofficially still on duty. They drove in. Silence. Jack wasn't avoiding conversation. There simply wasn't any to be had. The radio stayed off. Music had a way of pulling memories too close to the surface, and Jack had learned that silence was safer. He followed the GPS toward downtown Spokane, toward a law office he had never expected to visit, for reasons he never imagined would belong to him. The inheritance notice had arrived 2 weeks earlier, forwarded through a chain of outdated contacts until it finally reached him. The name attached to it had meant nothing at first. Clarence Miller. A distant relative, according to the paperwork. A man described as a former defense engineer who had disappeared from family gatherings sometime in the late 1960s and never reappeared. Jack had asked his mother about the name during a brief phone call. She had gone quiet for a moment before saying she remembered hearing it once, long ago, spoken with a mix of embarrassment and irritation. He didn't trust anyone, she had said. especially the government, built something underground and vanished. Best not to dig into it. Then she changed the subject, as families often do when old discomforts resurface. The law office sat on the second floor of a brick building near the river, its windows fogged slightly from the contrast between indoor heat and outdoor cold. Jack parked the truck, left Rex inside with the engine running, and stepped out into the snow. His boots left deep, deliberate prints as he crossed the sidewalk. Inside, the office smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee. The lawyer, Sarah Whitmore, rose from behind her desk when Jack entered. She was in her late 40s, tall and slender, posture straight but not rigid. Her hair was chestnut brown, worn in a neat bun streaked subtly with gray, and her face carried the kind of calm professionalism that came from decades of managing other people's problems without letting them become her own. Her skin was pale, her eyes sharp and observant behind thin-framed glasses. She offered a polite smile, one that softened slightly when she noticed Jack's uniform. "Mr. Miller," she said, extending a hand, "I'm Sarah Whitmore. Thank you for coming in on such short notice." Jack shook her hand, grip firm but restrained. "Didn't have much else planned," he replied, his voice even, low. She gestured for him to sit and wasted no time with pleasantries. She explained the basics quickly, efficiently. Clarence Miller had died 3 months earlier, alone, at the age of 86. No spouse, no children. After a long search, Jack had been identified as the closest living relative. The estate was small, very small. There were no bank accounts of note, no investments, no personal property worth mentioning. What remained was land. 18 acres outside Spokane, remote, undeveloped, and sitting on top of something unusual. Sarah slid a thin folder across the desk. "A Cold War-era underground structure," she said. "Built in 1962. According to county records, it has no functional designation and no assessed value beyond the land itself." Jack opened the folder, eyes scanning diagrams and faded photographs. Concrete, steel, ventilation shafts. He felt nothing at first, just the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever something unknown presented itself. "The land and structure are collectively valued at under $1,000, Sarah continued, "mostly because no one wants the liability. The county lists it as non-operational, non-essential, and frankly, not worth restoring. You're under no obligation to accept it." Jack closed the folder. Why would anyone build something like that and leave it? Sarah hesitated, then lowered her voice slightly, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Clarence lived off-grid for over 40 years. No utilities, no visitors. He refused inspections, and according to local records, he never allowed anyone underground." She reached into a drawer and removed a small ring of old brass keys, their surfaces worn smooth by time. When she placed them on the desk, they clinked softly, an ordinary sound that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet office. "These came with the property," she said. "One for the outer hatch, one for an internal door, the third—" She paused. "We don't know." Jack stared at the keys. He felt something shift, subtle but undeniable, like the first pressure change before a storm. Outside, Rex growled. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive. It was low, controlled, vibrating with a tension Jack recognized instantly. The kind of sound Rex made only when something was deeply wrong. Jack's head snapped toward the window just as the dog rose to his feet in the truck, ears rigid, eyes locked on the building. The growl deepened when Jack's fingers closed around the key ring. For a brief moment, Jack forgot the lawyer, the office, the snow outside. His attention narrowed to the animal he trusted more than any human alive. Rex wasn't reacting to the city. He wasn't reacting to strangers. He was reacting to the keys, as if he had seen them before, as if somewhere deep beneath the frozen ground of Spokane, something had just been disturbed. The land lay 30 miles outside Spokane, where the city thinned into forest and the road narrowed into something more remembered than maintained. Snow covered everything with a clean, deceptive calm, smoothing over ruts and broken ground as if trying to erase the past. Tall pine trees stood shoulder to shoulder, their branches heavy with white, filtering the winter sunlight into a cold, steady brightness that never quite warmed the skin. Jack Miller slowed the truck as the GPS lost confidence, then finally went silent. He cut the engine and sat still for a moment, listening. There was no traffic, no wind strong enough to stir the trees, only the distant creak of frozen branches settling under their own weight. Rex jumped down first when Jack opened the door, landing softly despite his size. Up close, the German Shepherd's age showed in subtle ways, a faint silvering around his muzzle, a stiffness that vanished once he began to move. His coat was thick and well kept, black along his back fading to tan on his legs and chest, fur built for cold climates and long hours outdoors. Rex did not wander. He did not sniff aimlessly. He moved with intent, nose low, body aligned as if following a trail no human could see. Jack followed, boots crunching through snow, breath steady, hands gloved but ready. The clearing revealed itself slowly, as if reluctant to be found. There was no fence, no signpost, nothing that suggested ownership or purpose. Only when Rex stopped did Jack see it, a flat square of concrete barely visible beneath the snow, edges softened by time and neglect. It looked less like a structure and more like a mistake someone had forgotten to correct. Jack crouched and brushed snow away with his sleeve, exposing a rusted steel ring embedded in the slab. Rex circled once, then planted himself beside it, paws digging instinctively into the frozen ground. Jack reached for the key ring. The same dull unease returned, a pressure behind his eyes, but he ignored it. He fitted the first key into the lock and twisted. The mechanism resisted, then gave with a metallic groan that echoed faintly beneath the earth. Jack wrapped his fingers around the ring and pulled. The hatch rose slowly, grudgingly, as if the ground itself resented being opened. A rush of cold, dry air poured out, carrying a scent that was neither decay nor dust, but something preserved, sealed away from weather and time. Rex leaned forward, nostrils flaring, ears rigid. A metal ladder descended into darkness. Jack switched on his flashlight and aimed the beam downward. The light revealed concrete walls, clean lines, no cracks, no moisture stains. This wasn't a ruin. It was intact. He tested the ladder with one boot, then another, weight-controlled, movements economical. Rex waited until Jack reached the bottom before following, claws clicking softly on metal rungs, body balanced with practiced ease. The bunker opened into a rectangular chamber reinforced with steel beams. The ceiling was low but solid, the concrete walls smooth and dry. Along one side sat a generator, old but meticulously maintained, its casing wiped clean, oil levels marked by neat handwriting on masking tape. Near it stood a filtration unit, ducts leading upward toward a ventilation shaft that disappeared into the ceiling. The air inside was cool but breathable, faintly metallic, circulating just enough to avoid stagnation. Metal shelves lined the opposite wall, stocked with empty crates and a few sealed containers, each labeled with dates that ranged from decades ago to just a few years prior. Jack swept the room methodically, flashlight beam steady, no signs of collapse, no water intrusion, no evidence of animals. He knelt beside the generator, ran a gloved finger along the casing, and found no dust thick enough to suggest abandonment. Someone had been here, recently. That knowledge settled in his chest like a weight. Rex moved through the space with quiet focus, pausing at each corner, nose working, tail held low but still. He stopped near the back wall, where the shelves ended and bare concrete stretched unbroken from floor to ceiling. The dog sniffed, stepped back, then pressed his nose closer, releasing a low sound deep in his throat. Not a bark, not a warning, a signal. Jack recognized it instantly. Rex used that sound when something didn't make sense, when instinct told him reality was lying. Jack approached, placing his palm flat against the concrete. The wall was cold like the rest, but when he knocked, the sound came back wrong. Hollow, subtle, but unmistakable. He knocked again, slower this time, then pressed his ear against the surface. Beneath the hum of the ventilation system, he thought he heard a faint echo, a space beyond the wall that shouldn't exist. He stepped back, scanning for seams, hinges, anything that might reveal a hidden mechanism. There was nothing. The concrete was seamless, smooth, intentionally anonymous. Whoever built this had not wanted the boundary noticed. Rex scratched once at the base of the wall, then looked up at Jack, eyes steady, unblinking, as if waiting for confirmation. Jack exhaled slowly. He had been trained to read spaces, to recognize when architecture lied. This wall was lying. He didn't know how yet or why, but he knew enough to stop. Pushing forward without understanding had gotten good men killed. He backed away, memorizing every detail, every sound, every smell. The bunker had revealed itself as functional, maintained, and deliberately incomplete. Whatever lay beyond that wall was meant to stay hidden, and Jack understood that opening it would change the nature of what he had inherited. He climbed the ladder first this time, Rex following close behind. The daylight above felt almost intrusive after the controlled stillness below. Jack sealed the hatch carefully, brushing snow back over the concrete until the clearing returned to its original, unremarkable state. Rex lingered a moment. Longer, nose pressed to the slab, then turned away only when Jack touched his collar. They stood together in the snow, surrounded by pine and silence, the city far behind them. Jack looked at the forest, the clean brightness of winter sunlight reflecting off white ground, and felt the quiet certainty that he had crossed a line he could not step back over. Somewhere beneath his boots, behind a wall that pretended not to exist, something waited, and it knew it had been heard. The bunker felt different the second time Jack Miller went down the ladder. The first descent had been instinctive, driven by caution and curiosity. This time, it was intentional. The air was the same, cold, dry, faintly metallic, but Jack noticed details he had ignored before. The ventilation hum was too steady, the temperature too even. This place wasn't merely surviving underground, it was being maintained. Jack set his pack down near the generator and removed his gloves. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles, nails cut short by habit rather than regulation now. He flexed his fingers once, grounding himself, then began opening the metal crates stacked along the shelves. Inside were binders wrapped in oilcloth, notebooks sealed in plastic sleeves, and folders stamped with faded warnings and serial numbers. No food logs, no survival checklists, no personal notes about weather or isolation. What he found instead were technical schematics, wiring diagrams, airflow calculations, and load-bearing stress tables drawn with precision and updated over decades. These were not the writings of a paranoid hermit. They were the records of an engineer who understood systems and expected them to be used. Jack flipped through one notebook after another, his eyes adjusting quickly to the shorthand. Acronyms leapt out at him, the kind drilled into his memory during briefings long ago. Power redundancy, containment zones, asset rotation intervals. The language was clinical, detached, and unmistakably military. Rex lay down near the base of the shelves, watching Jack without resting his head. His ears shifted at every small sound. The dog's coat caught the dim light, black fur absorbing it, tan markings standing out sharply. At 6 years old, Rex had slowed only slightly. His movements were still smooth, economical, shaped by years of working alongside men who relied on him to sense danger before they could. Jack had learned to read Rex's posture the same way he read terrain. Right now, the dog was alert in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Jack opened a thick binder bound in dark green canvas. The pages inside were yellowed but intact, filled with typed reports and handwritten annotations in the margins. Near the top of the first page, a designation appeared repeatedly, stamped in block letters that had faded to gray. Continuity Asset, Site 47B. Jack's jaw tightened. Continuity wasn't a word civilians used lightly, especially not during the Cold War. It belonged to doctrines, to worst-case scenarios planned by people who assumed the unthinkable would happen eventually. He turned page after page, finding references to distributed holding, non-centralized reserves, and long-term asset preservation under civilian cover. Clarence Miller's name appeared occasionally, always followed by a title that made Jack pause. Consulting engineer. Jack leaned back against the wall, the concrete cool against his spine. His uncle, if that was even the right word, had not been hiding from the government. He had been working with it, or at least adjacent to something that preferred not to exist on paper. The idea settled heavily in Jack's chest. He had spent years carrying out orders without always knowing their origin. This felt uncomfortably familiar. Rex rose suddenly. His head snapped toward the far corner of the bunker where a tall metal filing cabinet stood flush against the wall. The cabinet hadn't drawn Jack's attention before. It blended too well, painted the same dull gray as the surrounding concrete, handles worn smooth. Rex approached it slowly, nose twitching, body angled, weight shifted forward. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He stopped, muscles taut, eyes locked on the cabinet as if it might move. Jack followed, instincts sharpening. He reached for the top drawer and pulled. It slid open with a whisper, revealing rows of neatly labeled folders, dates, codes, locations. His pulse remained steady as he scanned them. Everything here was organized with a care that bordered on obsessive. This was not a man losing his grip on reality. This was someone following a mandate. When Jack reached the bottom drawer, Rex stepped closer, placing his body between Jack and the cabinet for a brief second before shifting aside. That was new. Rex rarely inserted himself physically unless he perceived immediate threat. Jack crouched, fingers closing around the handle. The drawer resisted, then stopped abruptly, as if blocked from within. Jack pulled harder. It opened only an inch. Something in Rex changed. His ears flattened slightly, breath slowing, body lowering, not in submission, but in preparation. Jack recognized the posture instantly. Rex wasn't afraid. He was bracing, the same way he had before door breaches overseas. Jack let go of the drawer. He studied the cabinet more carefully now. There, half hidden behind the metal lip near the floor, was a small recessed panel with a keyhole, not the main lock, a secondary one. It was old, its edges worn smooth by decades of careful use, but it was intact. Jack reached into his jacket and removed the keyring Sarah Whitmore had given him. The lawyer's face flickered briefly in his mind. Tall, composed, chestnut hair pulled back, eyes sharp but kind. She had looked genuinely relieved to pass the responsibility on, as if the keys themselves were a burden. Jack rotated the ring slowly until only one key remained, the unlabeled one. He held it up, turning it in the dim light. It was heavier than the others, its teeth cut differently, asymmetrical, deliberate. Rex watched the key, not Jack, his eyes following its movement with unsettling focus. Jack slid the key toward the lock but stopped short. His training whispered caution. Whatever lay beyond that cabinet was not meant to be accessed casually. The documents already told him enough to change the context of everything. This bunker was not a shelter. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure always served something larger. He withdrew the key and stood, placing it back on the ring. Rex exhaled quietly, tension easing but not disappearing. Jack closed the filing cabinet, careful to leave everything exactly as he had found it. He took photographs of the documents with his phone, methodical, precise, ensuring angles captured dates and labels without disturbing the arrangement. As he packed up, Jack felt the weight of the realization settle fully. This place was never intended for survival. It was intended for continuity, for preservation of something deemed essential enough to hide, decentralize, and forget. And now, by accident or design, it belonged to him. Jack shut off his flashlight and stood in the center of the bunker, listening. The hum of the ventilation system continued, indifferent. Rex moved to his side, pressing lightly against his leg, grounding him. Jack placed a hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur, and allowed himself one quiet thought before climbing back to the surface. This wasn't a civilian bunker, and whatever Clarence Miller had protected down here, it hadn't been meant to resurface quietly. Jack Miller stood alone in the bunker's main chamber, the unlabeled key resting in his palm as if it carried weight beyond metal. The hum of the ventilation system continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to decisions being made beneath it. Rex sat a few feet behind him, posture low and balanced, amber eyes fixed on Jack's hand. The dog's breathing was slow, controlled, the way it had been before doors opened in places Jack preferred not to name. Jack had learned to trust that stillness. It meant readiness, not fear. He knelt by the filing cabinet again, careful to leave no trace of urgency in his movements. The small, recessed keyhole waited near the base, almost apologetic in its discretion. Jack slid the key in. It turned with a soft, deliberate click that sounded too refined for something meant to be forgotten. A narrow section of the wall released with a whisper, revealing a seam Jack had missed before. He pressed gently, and the concrete panel swung inward on hidden hinges, opening into darkness that felt cleaner than the bunker itself. The air beyond was different, not stale, not recycled. It smelled neutral, like sealed rooms in controlled environments. Jack stepped through first, flashlight cutting a bright, steady beam across smooth concrete walls and a floor so clean it reflected light faintly. This space hadn't been abandoned, it had been preserved. The door sealed behind him with a muted thud, isolating the room completely. Rex followed without hesitation, nails clicking once before going silent as he adjusted to the surface. The room was smaller than the main chamber, but denser in purpose. Metal shelving lined every wall, rising from floor to ceiling in precise symmetry. On each shelf sat identical metal boxes, rectangular, matte gray, each stamped with a number in black ink. No dust, no corrosion. Jack's breath slowed as he counted the nearest column. 100 boxes within arm's reach, more beyond his flashlight's edge. Whoever had built this had planned for inventory, not improvisation. Jack moved closer, scanning labels. The numbering was sequential. No gaps, no corrections. The kind of order that suggested accountability to something unseen. He reached for the first box, fingers tightening around the latch. For a moment, he hesitated. He had opened doors before that could not be closed again. He knew the cost of curiosity. But this door was already open. He released the latch. Inside, foam padding cradled neatly stacked gold bars, each stamped and serialized, their surfaces dull rather than gleaming, as if light itself had been asked to keep its distance. Jack stared without blinking. He had seen gold before, in places where wealth meant leverage and danger traveled with it. This wasn't decorative. This was stored value, pure and deliberate. He closed the box carefully and opened another. Bearer bonds lay inside, sealed in protective sleeves, dates spanning decades, denominations that made his chest tighten. Another box held bundles of currency, older bills in pristine condition, notes he recognized only from training materials in museums. Further down the shelf, certificates printed on thick paper bore seals and signatures that no longer belonged to any institution he could name. Each box told the same story in a different language. This wasn't one man's savings. It was a reserve. Jack found a ledger tucked into a recessed slot behind the shelves. The book was bound in dark leather, edges worn smooth by careful handling. He opened it to the final page first, a habit formed from years of learning how men hid truth. A summary stared back at him, numbers aligned with clinical precision. Gold, bonds, currency, securities. The total sat at the bottom, understated in its simplicity. $302 million, adjusted. Jack closed the ledger slowly. He did not swear. He did not smile. He felt nothing at first, then everything at once. The weight of it pressed down, not as temptation, but as responsibility. Clarence Miller had not been hoarding wealth. He had been guarding it. For whom and for what, Jack did not yet understand. Rex moved closer, sniffing the boxes without touching them, then looked up at Jack. The dog's ears shifted, tracking a sound Jack couldn't hear yet. Jack replaced the ledger exactly where he had found it and latched the last box closed with deliberate care. He stood, scanning the room one final time, committing its layout to memory. The decision formed quickly. Whatever this was, it didn't belong to daylight. Jack sealed the hidden room, listening as the mechanism engaged and the concrete panel returned to anonymity. Back in the main chamber, the bunker felt suddenly ordinary, almost harmless by comparison. He climbed the ladder with Rex close behind, emerging into winter sunlight that seemed too bright after the controlled stillness below. Jack brushed snow back into place, restoring the clearing to its previous emptiness. The forest resumed its quiet watch. They were halfway back to the truck when Rex stopped, not abruptly, purposefully. The dog's body angled toward the tree line, muscles tightening, tail still. Jack followed his gaze. Between the trunks, partially obscured by falling snow, a black SUV sat idling at the edge of the clearing. No markings, engine running, too clean for the road that led here. Jack felt the cold sharpen. He reached down, fingers closing around Rex's collar, steadying both of them. Whoever sat inside that vehicle had found this place without asking, and they had arrived too quietly to be accidental. The knock came the morning after Jack Miller slept less than an hour. Snow still covered the ground in an unbroken white sheet, the winter sun high enough to keep everything painfully bright, as if the land itself refused to offer shadows. Jack had spent the night replaying the contents of the hidden room in his mind, not the numbers, not the impossible value, but the intent behind it all. Continuity, preservation, silence. He stood at the small window of the cabin above the bunker, watching the tree line, Rex seated beside him, alert but still. Rex was the first to sense the change. His ears rotated forward, body stiffening, head turning toward the dirt road that cut through the forest. Jack followed the dog's gaze just as a dark SUV emerged between the trees, its black paint stark against the snow. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately, tires leaving precise tracks as it came to a stop well short of the cabin. Jack didn't reach for a weapon. There wasn't one, but his posture changed all the same, shoulders squaring, breathing slowing. The man who stepped out of the SUV was in his mid-50s, average height, lean build, dressed in a charcoal wool coat that looked expensive without being flashy. His hair was gray at the temples, neatly combed, his face narrow with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that seemed permanently set in a practiced, neutral line. He moved with the confidence of someone used to being listened to, but not the arrogance of someone who enjoyed it. Jack noted the details automatically. This was not a local official. This was someone sent. Rex placed himself directly in front of Jack as the man approached, standing tall, chest forward, tail still. The German shepherd's amber eyes never left the stranger. It wasn't aggression, it was assessment. "Morning," the man said, stopping a respectful distance away. His voice was calm, professional, carrying easily through the cold air. "Jack Miller?" Jack didn't answer immediately. "Who's asking?" The man reached slowly into his coat and produced a badge and identification, holding them out just long enough to be seen, not long enough to be taken. "Ethan Cole, Federal Records and Archives. I'm here regarding a property transfer connected to Clarence Miller." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Jack felt the ripple move through him, but kept his face unreadable. "You're early," he said. Ethan Cole smiled faintly, the expression never touching his eyes. "When records are old, they tend to surface all at once. I'm sure you understand." Up close, Jack could see the lines around the man's eyes, the faint discoloration beneath them that suggested long hours and little sleep. Cole wasn't nervous. He was careful. Rex shifted his weight slightly, blocking the path to the cabin door without being told. Ethan noticed, his gaze flicking down to the dog with interest rather than fear. "Military working dog," he said. "Germans, shepherd, retired, I assume." Jack's jaw tightened. "You assume a lot." "Occupational hazard," Ethan replied evenly. "I won't take much of your time. We've identified this site as a Cold War-era structure. Our interest is purely archival, old documents, maintenance records, anything that might need proper storage." He paused, then added, "Nothing personal, nothing financial." Jack studied him for a long moment. He thought of Sarah Whitmore's steady eyes as she slid the keys across her desk, the way she had lowered her voice when she spoke of Clarence's isolation. He thought of the locked room underground, the metal boxes, the silence that felt intentional. "Do you have a warrant?" Jack asked. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something subtle hardened. "No," he said. "We were hoping to keep this informal." "Then we're done," Jack replied. The silence that followed was sharp. Rex let out a low, controlled sound, not loud enough to echo, but enough to underline the finality of the moment. Ethan took a step back, hands raised slightly in a placating gesture. "I understand your caution," he said. "If you reconsider, my card." He placed a business card on the edge of the cabin's wooden railing, the white paper stark against weathered brown. "We'll be in touch." He turned and walked back to the SUV without another word. Jack watched until the vehicle disappeared into the trees, the sound of its engine swallowed by the forest. Only then did he release the breath he'd been holding. Rex remained at his side, eyes still fixed on the road, long after the threat had passed. The rest of the day passed in tense quiet. Jack didn't go back down into the bunker. He circled the property instead, following the perimeter, counting steps, noting sightlines. The snow made everything visible, every track, every disturbance. As the light began to fade, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. Thin metal stakes, partially buried, spaced irregularly around the clearing. Jack knelt, brushing snow away with a gloved hand. They were small, no bigger than a pen, with faint markings etched along their sides. Signal markers, or something close to it. That night, Jack didn't sleep at all. He sat at the small table inside the cabin, flashlight off, listening to the sounds of the forest. Rex lay at his feet, eyes closed but alert, breathing slow. Around midnight, Jack stepped outside and followed the stakes into the trees. There, hidden beneath snow and pine needles, he found them. Compact devices no larger than a paperback book, partially buried, angled toward the bunker's location. Jack didn't touch them. He didn't need to. He recognized surveillance equipment when he saw it. Whoever Ethan Cole represented hadn't come to browse archives. They had come to confirm. Jack returned to the cabin before dawn, mind racing through options he didn't like. He knew enough to understand that once attention like this arrived, it rarely left quietly. The bunker was no longer a secret. It was a question mark, and governments hated unanswered questions. It was Rex who broke the tension. Just after sunrise, while Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, Rex began digging near the tree line. Not randomly, purposefully. Snow flew in clean arcs as the dog worked, muscles moving with controlled urgency. Jack joined him, hands numbing as he dug. Within minutes, metal scraped against shovel and paw. They uncovered a container, cylindrical, military green, sealed tight, its surface scratched and worn. It was buried deeper than frost alone could explain, deliberately hidden. Jack wiped the snow away. Heart pounding. This wasn't listed in any document he had seen. It wasn't part of the bunker's schematics. Rex stepped back, watching Jack intently, as if waiting for permission. Jack rested a hand on the container, feeling the cold seep through his glove. Whatever Clarence Miller had hidden here, it wasn't meant to stay buried forever. And now, with black SUVs in the forest and eyes watching from afar, Jack knew one thing for certain. The knock hadn't been a courtesy. It had been a warning. The metal container lay half buried beneath the snow where Rex had uncovered it, its surface scarred and darkened by time but sealed tight, edges welded with a care that spoke of intent rather than haste. Jack Miller knelt beside it in the cold forest light, breath steady, heart quieter than it should have been. He had learned long ago that fear announced itself loudly. This feeling was different. This was recognition. The container was heavier than it looked. Jack brushed the remaining snow away with gloved hands, then levered it open using a short pry bar from his pack. The lid released with a dull, reluctant creak. Inside were waterproof document cases, vacuum-sealed bundles, and a thin leather portfolio wrapped in oilcloth. Everything was arranged with precision, not hidden in panic, but stored with expectation. Rex stood close, shoulders squared, nose twitching once before he looked away, satisfied that this was not an explosive threat. Jack carried the container into the bunker, resealing the hatch behind him. The controlled air of the underground space wrapped around him again, familiar now, almost comforting. He set the contents on the work table beneath the light and began opening them one by one. The first folder held documents stamped with warnings that made his jaw tighten. Classified, eyes only, Continuity Operations Division. The language was unmistakable. As Jack read, pieces began to align. Orders bearing Pentagon letterhead, signatures from offices that technically no longer existed. Memos outlining a program designed to survive the collapse of central authority by dispersing assets into decentralized civilian hands. Engineers, contractors, people with technical skill and no public visibility. Clarence Miller's name appeared repeatedly, not as a fugitive or a rogue, but as a custodian. A man trusted to hold something the government itself did not want to remember it had created. Jack leaned back, rubbing a hand over his beard. Clarence hadn't been hiding from the government. He had been obeying it, quietly, long after the world moved on. And when the Cold War ended without the catastrophe everyone had prepared for, the program had been buried, not dismantled, forgotten, or intentionally abandoned. Rex shifted closer, resting his head briefly against Jack's knee. The dog's eyes were calm, steady, reflecting the light. Jack rested a hand on Rex's neck, grounding himself. He thought of the room behind the hidden wall, the numbered metal boxes, the ledger estimating more than $300 million in gold, bearer bonds, and untraceable financial instruments. This wasn't theft. It was legacy. Dangerous legacy. Jack's training resurfaced, the old mental checklists, worst-case scenarios, contingency planning. He knew what happened to people who stumbled into secrets like this without preparation. They lost control quickly, either to greed or to authority. He would not do either. He began moving assets carefully, not out of panic but strategy. A small portion at a time, enough to create options if the bunker was compromised. He cataloged everything he touched, photographed documents, resealed cases. Rex watched silently, occasionally lifting his head when distant sounds filtered through the ventilation system. It was near dusk when the light changed, not inside the bunker, but outside. Rex's ears snapped upright, body going rigid. Jack froze, listening. The faint crunch of tires on snow. The unmistakable whine of engines idling. He moved to the camera feed he had installed earlier that day. A simple setup, nothing that would draw attention. The monitor flickered, then resolved into grainy images of the clearing. Black SUVs, 2 of them. Parked at the tree line, lights off at first, then suddenly flaring to life, beams cutting through the snow like blades. Jack felt the shift in the air even underground. The past hadn't just come back, it had arrived armed. He shut down the monitor and moved quickly but calmly, securing the documents back into their cases. Rex followed at his heel, posture tight, focused. Jack knew he had minutes, not hours. Whatever Clarence had been part of, it was no longer forgotten. Someone had remembered, and they had come prepared. The headlights cut through the snowfall like blades. They appeared at the edge of the tree line just after dusk, white beams sweeping slowly across the clearing as if the forest itself were being searched, interrogated. Jack Miller stood near the bunker hatch, the collar of his winter jacket turned up, NWU visible beneath, breath steady despite the sudden tightening in his chest. Rex was already in position, body angled forward, paws planted wide in the snow, ears locked on the approaching vehicles. This was not curiosity. This was recognition. 2 SUVs rolled to a stop at a deliberate distance, engines idling. Men stepped out, silhouettes first, then shapes as the lights adjusted. There were 4 of them. All male, all dressed in dark winter coats that hid their frames but not their posture. One stood slightly ahead of the others, tall, broad, shoulders squared with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He was in his mid-40s, Jack guessed, with a thick neck, close-cropped hair graying at the temples, and a trimmed beard that softened but did not hide the hard lines of his face. His eyes were sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man who had spent years reading threats in other people's silence. "Mr. Miller?" the man called out, voice calm, practiced. "I'm Daniel Foster, Federal Continuity Oversight." He said it as if the title should explain everything. Jack didn't move. "You're on private property," he replied evenly. "You don't have a warrant." Foster smiled faintly, the expression not reaching his eyes. "We're not here to make this difficult. We just need to verify some materials tied to a legacy program. Old paperwork, nothing that concerns you." Rex took a step forward, placing himself squarely between Jack and the men. His growl was low, controlled, vibrating through the cold air. Not a warning meant to scare, but a statement of fact. Foster's gaze flicked briefly to the dog, then back to Jack. "You should put the dog away," Foster said. Jack's jaw tightened. He's right where he needs to be. One of the men behind Foster shifted, his coat opening slightly to reveal the outline of a weapon beneath. Jack clocked it instantly. Armed, not local law enforcement, not here for a friendly audit. The snow continued to fall, soft flakes catching in Rex's fur, settling on Jack's shoulders, as if the world were trying to remain calm while everything underneath tensed toward violence. Foster took a step closer. "Mr. Miller, we have reason to believe classified federal assets are stored on this site. Your refusal to cooperate could be interpreted as obstruction." Jack laughed once, short and humorless. "You don't even know what's here. You're fishing." Foster's smile vanished. "We know enough." Jack felt the familiar pull of old instincts, the urge to calculate angles, distances, outcomes. He could hold them off for a moment, maybe longer. But this wasn't a battlefield. There would be consequences that followed him long after the snow melted. He raised one hand slightly, palm open, a signal not of surrender but of control. "Come back with a warrant," Jack said. "Until then, we're done." The air stretched thin. Foster studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll be in touch." The SUVs reversed, lights sweeping the clearing one last time before disappearing back into the forest. Night fell hard after that. The clearing returned to silence, but it was no longer empty. Jack felt watched, measured, as if unseen lines had been drawn around the land. Rex remained alert long after the engines faded, pacing the perimeter, nose to the ground, tracking disturbances Jack couldn't see. Inside the bunker, the lights glowed dim and steady. Jack sat at the metal table, gloves off, hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't realized he'd poured. The warmth did little to chase the cold that had settled deeper than his skin. He replayed the encounter in his head, every word, every shift in posture. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to remind him who held power. Jack pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number he had saved but never expected to use. The call connected after 2 rings. "This is Michael Grant," the voice said. Grant was a former federal prosecutor, early 50s, lean build, sharp cheekbones, hair gone silver long before his time. He'd left government service years earlier after a case that had ended abruptly, quietly. Officially, he'd retired. Unofficially, he'd stopped believing the system always corrected itself. Jack had met him once through a veterans legal network, a man who spoke plainly and listened more than he talked. "They found me," Jack said without preamble. There was a pause. That didn't take long. Jack explained everything: the bunker, the documents, the assets, the men in the snow. Grant listened without interrupting, absorbing the details with unsettling calm. When Jack finished, the line went quiet for several seconds. "You're sitting on something they don't want acknowledged," Grant said finally. "If it goes public, it rewrites parts of history. They'll do almost anything to avoid that." "So what's the play?" Jack asked. Grant exhaled. "You have 2 options. You disappear, keep everything, and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Or you give most of it back on your terms and buy your freedom." Jack leaned back, staring at the concrete ceiling. "They won't stop." "No," Grant agreed. "But they don't need everything. They need silence, and silence is something you can sell." After the call ended, Jack sat in the bunker for a long time, listening to Rex's steady breathing nearby. He thought about Clarence Miller, about decades spent guarding something no one could ever thank him for. He thought about his own years of service, about missions completed that would never be acknowledged publicly, sacrifices folded into classified reports. He understood now. This was the same war, just fought in paperwork and shadows instead of fire. By morning, Jack had made his decision. He moved with purpose, selecting what could be relocated quickly, what could be documented, what could be leveraged if necessary. Rex stayed close, carrying light loads in his pack with practiced ease. By the time the sun rose over the pines, Jack was standing at the edge of the clearing again, snow bright beneath his boots, the land quiet but no longer uncertain. Rex sat beside him, shoulder touching Jack's leg, eyes forward. Jack rested a hand on the dog's head, fingers pressing gently into thick fur. "I won't let this secret be buried with us," Jack said aloud, the words steady, final. Rex did not bark. He did not move. He simply stayed as he always had, ready for whatever came next. The agreement was signed in a room that looked deliberately ordinary. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a long table polished to the point of impersonality. No flags, no seals, nothing that suggested history or power, yet everything about the room carried the weight of both. Jack Miller sat straight-backed in his chair, shoulders squared out of habit, his U.S. Navy working uniform pressed and clean despite the long weeks that had led to this moment. Across from him sat 3 men and 1 woman whose names would never appear in any public record connected to what had happened beneath the snow outside Spokane. They were calm, composed, and careful in the way people are when they understand exactly how much leverage they hold and how much they are trying not to use it. The woman led the meeting. Her name, as introduced, was Helen Crawford. She was in her early 50s, tall and narrow-shouldered, her posture precise without being rigid. Her hair was silver blonde, cut short and practical, framing a face marked by fine lines that spoke of long years spent making decisions that affected lives she would never meet. Her eyes were pale gray, analytical, revealing nothing. She spoke softly, but every word landed with authority. She had not raised her voice once throughout the negotiations, and she had not needed to. People listened when Helen Crawford spoke. Jack listened too. He always had. Listening had kept him alive. The terms were simple in language and complex in consequence. Jack would return the vast majority of the assets discovered in the bunker and the buried container, gold, bearer bonds, documents, all cataloged and removed under federal supervision. In exchange, he would retain a legally sanctioned portion sufficient to rebuild his life, enough to ensure security without drawing attention. No charges would be filed, no investigation would continue. The bunker and the land above it would be transferred into his name permanently, stripped of any classified designation. What had existed there would be officially reclassified as non-operational historical infrastructure. The past would be sealed, not with concrete or steel, but with silence. Jack signed without hesitation, not because the choice was easy, but because it was clear. He had lived long enough knowing the difference. Rex waited outside the building, sitting patiently in the snow-dusted courtyard, his black and tan coat stark against the white ground. At 7 now, his movements were a fraction slower, but his presence was unchanged, solid, attentive, unshakably loyal. When Jack stepped outside, Rex rose immediately and pressed his shoulder against Jack's leg, grounding him in a way no handshake ever could. Jack rested a gloved hand on the dog's head, fingers curling into thick fur, and for the first time in months, he exhaled without bracing for what came next. The return to Spokane felt different. The city was the same, snow-lined streets, pale winter sun reflecting off rooftops. But something inside Jack had shifted. The constant readiness, the expectation of confrontation had eased, not vanished. It never did, but softened enough to allow space for something else. Work began quietly. Jack did not announce his plans. He hired contractors who asked few questions and paid them well for their discretion. The bunker was upgraded carefully, respectfully, as if it were a living thing rather than a structure. Power systems were modernized, ventilation improved, emergency supplies updated. Above ground, a modest building was constructed, not a fortress, not a monument, just a functional lodge that blended into the forest like it had always belonged there. The purpose of the place became clear only to those who needed it. Veterans arrived first, men and women Jack recognized instantly, not by name but by posture, by the way they scanned rooms without thinking, by the way silence sat on them differently. They came with paperwork, with stories they told only when ready, with eyes that had seen too much, and voices that carried restraint like armor. Some stayed a night, some stayed a week. All left steadier than they arrived. Then came the dogs. Military working dogs retired into uncertainty, into shelters that did their best but were never designed for animals trained to protect, detect, and endure. German shepherds, Belgian Malinois, older Labradors with cloudy eyes and aching joints. Jack built kennels that felt less like containment and more like rest. Rex supervised everything, moving among them with quiet authority, teaching by presence alone that this was a place of safety. Winter deepened, snow fell often, soft and constant, blanketing the land in white that reflected sunlight so brightly it forced the world to look clean, even when it wasn't. Mornings became Jack's favorite time. He would step outside just after dawn, breath visible, the world hushed, Rex at his side. The bunker entrance, once a secret, now sat openly beneath the trees, not advertised, not hidden, simply there. One morning, as light filtered through falling snow, Jack stood in full NWU, jacket zipped against the cold, boots planted firmly on ground that no longer felt hostile. Rex sat beside him, calm, alert, his ears catching distant sounds of wind through pine. Jack looked at the door one last time as the contractors finished their work and stepped away. The door closed with a solid, final sound. Not the sound of something being hidden, the sound of something being secured. Jack did not turn away immediately. He rested his hand on the cold steel, feeling its strength, thinking of Clarence Miller, the man who had built this place for an end that never came, and of how that preparation had found its true purpose decades later. Legacy, Jack realized, was not about what you hoarded, it was about what you protected when it mattered. Rex leaned into him, steady and warm. The snow continued to fall, light and unhurried, as if the world itself had decided for once not to rush. And beneath that white silence, a shelter remained, not to guard secrets, but to guard people who had already given more than most ever would. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels in the sky. Sometimes they come buried under snow, hidden beneath years of silence, waiting for the right moment and the right soul to uncover them. Jack didn't find this place because he was lucky. He found it because he kept walking when it would have been easier to stop, because he stayed faithful when the world felt empty, because God often works not through comfort, but through endurance. In our daily lives, many of us feel forgotten. We carry quiet battles no one sees, bills, losses, loneliness, fear about tomorrow, and like Jack, we may think the war is over, yet the hardest missions begin when no one is watching. But this story reminds us of something timeless. God does not waste pain. What feels like delay is often preparation. What looks abandoned may be protected for a reason. And what seems small, worthless even, can become a blessing meant not just for us, but for others. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder today. You are not invisible. Your struggle has meaning. And even in the coldest seasons of life, God is still working beneath the surface. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you in quiet ways you don't always notice. And may hope find you exactly when you need it most. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need encouragement today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to pray for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, resilience, and the quiet miracles that still happen every day. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and may God walk with you always.